Some of you may or may not know, I come from the pharmaceutical industry, even though I'm a professor now, and I have an interest in drug development. So we have two experts, Anne-Marie Finley and Naomi Lopez-Bauman. I think they're going to talk sequentially. So Anne-Marie first, about what they wrote in chapters in the book. And I won't reiterate that because you're going to say it in a moment. I think for Anne-Marie, it's going to be a little bit about the Orphan Drug Act, but also I'm asking both of them to comment about the development, the accelerated development, especially of vaccines, but also drugs for COVID, and the role that FDA regulations play in that. And Anne-Marie is especially qualified. She had a significant role in the Food and Drug Administration. She was appointed by President George Bush years ago, and has also had regulatory roles in pharmaceutical biotech companies as well, and is still very active as a regulatory advisor and consultant. So Anne-Marie, thanks for being here and looking forward to hear what you have to share.
Thank you very much, Dan, for the opportunity to participate in this wonderful conference today. This pandemic shines a light on ways we can do better across the healthcare system. As we begin to look beyond COVID and towards other disease areas, we can look at ways to harness technology and facilitate innovation, as well as evolve regulation towards a more rapid development and commercialization of drugs for unmet medical needs, pandemic or otherwise. I wanted to focus on 5 things that FDA has done in terms of steps to advance COVID therapies. And then I thought I would focus on 5 things I think we can expect out of this evolution of FDA regulations. I'm not a big fan of simplifying as a term, so I'm not going to use that in this particular context, because I think we often forget that it's not a matter of taking away a regulation, it's a matter of evolving it or amending it to meet new needs as science evolves and as our needs evolve. Particularly, the first thing FDA did, and I think this is a success story that goes back over 20 years, they've worked very diligently with NIH, with companies, with academic institutions to identify potential therapies from compound libraries and get that information into libraries that are available, both some privately, some publicly, to researchers, to patient organizations who are looking for targets for new drugs. Remdesivir is one of those compounds identified from the compound library. And there is a big push from NIH, National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, to ensure that we look there first before we start trying to invent or discover new drugs. And that was 20 years ago that I sat with a client at FDA and they said, you know, we really would like to get access to those compound libraries. And the client that I was working with was one of the first to make them available. It was Pfizer, it's not a secret. But the availability of that information was directly applicable to the rapidness of being able to find something that's now in phase 3. FDA also established a master protocol for drug therapies in development. FDA, NIH, and industry worked together to facilitate the implementation of a master protocol that can be used in multiple clinical trials and allows for study of more than one promising new drug for COVID at the same time. It's established a clear framework of goals and endpoints for proof of safety and efficacy. And it has centralized trials for drugs that are designed to decrease the inflammation of the lungs, the primary cause of death for SARS-CoV-2 patients. A number of these trials are now enrolling, including programs that are testing products such as the interleukin-6 inhibitors and the JAK inhibitors, which are already approved to treat various other conditions, including rheumatoid arthritis. This master protocol enabled the agency to quickly identify those drugs that were not working in this setting. And on June 15th, it revoked its emergency use authorization for hydroxychloroquine in the strategic national stockpile that were used for hospitalized patients with COVID, when studies showed that the risk-benefit ratio didn't warrant continued use and in fact presented a risk to many of those patients. Thirdly, the FDA has rapidly advanced new products, such as convalescent plasma, using regulatory muscle and innovation. Over a very short time, more than 1,600 sites and over 2,100 physician investigators nationwide have signed on to a master protocol administered by the Mayo Clinic, which the FDA helped facilitate. A number of clinical trials are also taking place to evaluate the safety and efficacy of convalescent plasma and to advance a hyperimmune globulin with COVID antibodies. FDA has rapidly advanced vaccine trials for a number of promising candidates, some of which started phase 3 this week. So when we consider the fact that we didn't have those candidates really identified by February 1st, I think that's really a monumental innovation in regulation. And the FDA has granted numerous single-patient emergency and investigational new drug applications as well, enabling patients in dire need to have access to therapies under evaluation and review. How will this COVID experience color our future? As we look beyond COVID and towards the future, what can we learn from this experience? I think the first is that the more extensive use of app technologies, artificial intelligence, are really helpful. There are telehealth and wearables that collect real-world data, which FDA is committed to including in clinical trials, and timely information for clinical trials and associated patient visits. So you haven't lost quite as much in some clinical trials in terms of information collection that you might have if you hadn't had access to these kinds of apps. I'm wearing a Fitbit, and I've been asked by several organizations if they can monitor me and utilize my data to determine if I can contribute to early identification of signs of COVID infection. So I think that's a real opportunity to move forward in identifying those symptoms and that may be helpful in advancing new therapies. I think we have, secondly, a greater recognition of what we're missing in drug development. There's certainly a greater attention at this time on racial disparities in drug development. We have African Americans constitute 13% of the population, but over 23% of COVID deaths. Minorities are greatly underrepresented in clinical trials. And for an example, there's a breast cancer therapy that's currently being very actively promoted in magazines for African American women. But there was only one African American woman in that trial. And we also see a dearth of researchers and physicians who, from minority ranks, which makes it difficult to recruit patients if they don't see people who look like themselves and for whom they have some commonality. Harvard has a big initiative on this issue. They're coming out with a white paper in September. It'll be very interesting to see what their conclusions are. Thirdly, there's a greater focus on mental health and drug development strategies and psychiatric drugs. In my humble opinion, this is probably the most needy area in terms of flexibility in clinical trial design. These trials are admittedly difficult to conduct in mental health and substance abuse populations, but certainly we're seeing recognition of the impact that this pandemic is having on mental health and substance abuse problems in this country, and we will have to be more flexible in how we address it. I think we can expect that we will accelerate innovation in the future. There's certainly greater cooperation across the divide for COVID. Specifically, companies large and small, academic medical centers, hospital systems, federal regulatory officials, and state and local governments have been incentivized to cooperate in the face of the pandemic. Anyone who's ever tried to get a legal agreement from one university to another understands how important it is to overcome research barriers that I think in this particular case we've been able to do quite effectively. And I think that's basically an attitudinal adjustment regarding working across institutional barriers. Finally, I think we need to continue to develop a therapeutic armamentarium for future pandemics. 20 years ago, I was the chief investigator for the Committee on Government Reform in the House of Representatives for a study on why infectious agents, particularly HIV, hepatitis B and C, moved through the blood supply. What we found, what the Institute of Medicine concurred, was that we were essentially blind as healthcare ecosystem to the threat of an unknown pathogen. Regrettably, we recognize and we have materials in the Strategic National Stockpile for tularemia and for anthrax and a variety of other pandemics we expected. But with coronavirus, the most of that research is being done in veterinary medical schools. It's a zoonotic disease, and it was seen as a bigger threat to cats than it was to humans. The funding has been extremely low over the last 20 years, bumping up from about $3 million to $5 million in 2005 to about $50 million during MERS and SARS. But now it's down to about 25 million. And as a result of this, we did not have a known animal model, a clear animal model for working on this disease, and it became a real problem in terms of development. So I think we have to do a better job in terms of preparations for the future and be more broad-minded in what we can expect in terms of threats. So thank you.
Over there.
Okay.
Because I wanted to ask Naomi some questions, if you want to have a seat. We're almost 6 feet apart. So thanks. Yeah, I think, for sure, I think we need to think more about preparedness for things like the pandemic. I in the early 2000s was an infectious disease researcher, and there was little interest in infectious disease back then.
And you never even thought about coronavirus at that time.
TB, malaria, things like that.
The biggies.
So thanks, Anne-Marie. And Anne-Marie also did a great chapter about orphan drugs, rare diseases, which is a really interesting topic as well. So Naomi is here as well. Naomi Lopez-Bauman, Director of Healthcare Policy at Goldwater Institute. She did a great chapter as well on, I guess she called them N=1 clinical trials, where you have sort of a genotype for a very specific disease. But I asked you to comment, a little bit more broadly, Naomi, if you will, about some of what's going on with COVID as well, or frankly, anything you want to talk about.
Thank you so much for having me today. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so it's wonderful to be back at your annual conference, and I look forward to next year when we can all be there physically in person. So earlier this year, I heard this fantastic quote from Warren Buffett, and he was talking about corporate balance sheets. But I think it applies just as well to the state of the FDA right now. What he said is that it's not until the tide goes out that you realize who's been swimming naked. And now that we're in the midst of this pandemic, we have really clearly seen the ability for the FDA to accelerate approvals when all eyes are on them and when they're directing resources to that. And so I think I'm very optimistic about the future of drug development and the way in which the velocity of change is accelerating in this particular area, not just because of the way I foresee the regulatory process to change, but also because of the rate of change that we're seeing in medical advances. So as we know, for too many people, the US drug approval system is too slow, it's broken, and it blocks too many Americans from potentially life-saving medicines and treatments until the FDA gives the final green light on that treatment. But that can take more than a decade. It can take well over $1 billion to get that final FDA green light. So in 2014, the Goldwater Institute, partnering with patients, doctors, and advocates, took this movement to protect patient autonomy to all the states across the country. The Right to Try movement blossomed, and in just 4 short years through this grassroots movement, which was also bipartisan, we were able to get the Right to Try Act passed in 41 states. And then in 2018, what seemed impossible became a reality. President Trump signed the Federal Right to Try Act, and that was actually sponsored by Senator Johnson, who spoke to us this morning. So fortunately, Right to Try is starting to change things. Accelerating treatment for patients whose lives hang in the balance didn't start with Right to Try, and it certainly didn't end with it. But it was absolutely important to where we are today in terms of the bright light that's been shown on the drug approval process and the obstacles that remain for patients to get potentially life-saving treatment, particularly for those terminally ill patients who have run out of options. So it was signed into federal law in 2018, and it protects the right of terminally ill patients to try a medicine that's received basic safety approval, phase 1, from the FDA, and that's being given to other patients as well. It's a declaration that people should be able to decide for themselves in consultation with their physicians, and when manufacturers are able and willing to make that treatment available, whether that they should be able to access these treatments that could prolong or even save their lives, and without having to ask the federal government for permission. However, even today though, even though that we've seen a lot of progress on this front, there are now new personalized treatments for the one individual patient. There's a small handful of individualized treatments that are now entering FDA clinical trials. Sometimes they target a specific gene mutation, for example. These personalized treatments are customized to that one individual patient. These N-of-1 therapies include ASO therapies, sometimes they're stem cell therapies, or neoantigen-derived therapies. These are really challenging because the FDA regulations created decades ago, this clinical trial process, was originally designed for trials with hundreds or even thousands of patients in mind, and never for these N-of-1 type treatments. So Right to Try, which is available to patients now only after the treatment has passed the FDA's basic safety testing in phase 1, and it remains in clinical review, but has not yet received final FDA approval, would not generally apply to these newer individualized treatments because only a small handful of these treatments have even reached the phase 1 clinical trials. Furthermore, the current system for these individual treatments, by definition, lack a separate standalone safety threshold evaluation. Because we know that no two patients would ever receive the same exact treatment under these N-of-1 trials, the safety and efficacy are, as a result, tested simultaneously in that phase 1 and only on that one individualized patient. So while we do know that the data gathered from these N-of-1 treatments in phase 1 might inform the broader safety profile, it certainly is not the same as the general population trials. So the patients seeking personalized treatments are no less in need of prompt access to life-saving treatments. And at the same time, establishing that a personalized treatment is safe primarily has consequences for that one individual. And these are, generally speaking, safer treatments in terms of adverse events and toxicity than other treatments that we typically see for these rare diseases. So as the availability and accessibility of these next generation genetic sequencing treatments increases, more patients, especially those with rare and ultra rare terminal illnesses, will be seeking these types of treatments more often. So, requiring these patients who are receiving these individualized treatments to go through this clinical trial process, it's a regulatory mismatch. It's a square peg in a round hole. And after all, we know that the goal of the clinical trial process is to learn something about the treatment that will be generally applicable to a larger group of patients, ultimately the entire population. Even after FDA final approval, we know that there's still evaluation going on after it's called phase 4. But in clinical care, where we're actually trying to help that one patient, the primary goal is treating the individual. And the current regulatory system for personalized medicine subjects the patient seeking individual care to a system that's actually designed for general study. And that's why the Goldwater Institute is pursuing what we call Right to Try 2.0, which would entail basic safety, toxicity studies, for example, perhaps institutional review board review, so that a patient who has run out of options would be able to seek that individualized treatment before it has actually received FDA approval. Very quickly, I'd like to comment on a couple of items as they relate to COVID. I think I'm very optimistic about the future of accelerating clinical approvals, we know that we're already looking towards Cures 2.0, as well as the PDUFA reauthorization, where technical discussions around that have already begun. We also know that the Europeans have been focusing more on the early end treatment for COVID, where the United States has been focusing more on the more severe cases and the vaccine development. Although, you know, we've all been, including Asia, have all been working on all of it, but that's kind of where our strengths lie, at least it looks like at the moment. So I think that we're going to be seeing a lot more efforts for harmonization down the road as well, which is very promising. We also know that master protocols have already been used in the oncology space. Anne-Marie referenced the master protocols for COVID, but this is already being done in the area of oncology, which is allowing these clinical trials to go out to the community. When you have these master protocols, it makes it a lot easier to gather the scientific data and provide this early access to patients through the trial process, or through compassionate use, or through right to try. And so I think that we're going to see even more of that occur, which is very promising whenever you are looking to get a more racially or ethnically diverse type population into these trials. This is going to help enormously. And then we also, I think one of the areas of great importance is this area of off-label use. We know that hydroxychloroquine has been in the news quite a bit. We also know that dexamethasone has also been in the news for these off-label treatments. Some people confuse this with right to try. It is not right to try, as I've already explained. These are already FDA approved treatments. It's perfectly legal to prescribe these for an indication other than what's on the FDA label. But I do think as a result of the COVID crisis and the very, very heavy reliance on looking at repurposing already FDA approved drugs, that we are going to see changes in these FDA gag rules that prevent manufacturers from talking and sharing truthful and scientific information with physicians and insurers out in the healthcare field. So in a quick summary, I'm very optimistic about the future of clinical development, and the fact that we do now know, there's this tacit admission that we can move much faster. The fact that the fastest vaccine we've ever had in our history for mumps was done in 4 years. We are now actually, maybe under FDA emergency authorization, we could actually be able to access that in a year. That is unheard of, and it really does point to the ability to remove these regulatory obstacles and really speed up the process without sacrificing the safety and efficacy of these treatments to bring them to the patients who need them the most.
Right. Thanks, Naomi. Yeah, I think a flaw of mine is I pack in too many really good speakers in a small amount of time, because I wish we could talk about this more. Naomi and Anne-Marie really elaborate on these topics a lot in the book, by the way, although I'm not trying to sell you a book, I'm giving you one for free. So, but it is remarkable, the speed with which vaccines are being developed this year, unprecedented. And a lot of it is just the coordination and Francis Collins did talk about how no shortcuts were taken, that there's no significant safety risk with this process. And I think the theme in all of this, which we probably should have had 2 hours for, is there are ways to constantly evolve regulations and adjust them to situations. In Anne-Marie's case, she was talking about rare diseases, which are less than 100,000 patients. So you have to be able to, how do I deal with that situation? And then Naomi was talking, well, what about if you have only one patient? So you have to figure out how to do regulatory flexibility for those situations. And now we have a pandemic where a lot of lives could be lost if we don't move fast. So the theme that I wish we had more time to talk about is how to be flexible with the regulations and still keep people safe. So thanks, Anne-Marie, and thanks, Naomi.